They call it Indiana, the land of the Indians, but here's the haunting question. How can a state carry such a name, when so few of the people it honors remain on the land today? It's a name carved into maps, whispered in history books, and repeated in classrooms, but behind it lies a story most Americans have never been told. Indiana's name suggests pride, even respect, for the first people who walked its soil: the Miami, the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Delaware, the Kickapoo. Tribes whose roots ran deeper than the rivers that cut across this land. But when you look closer, that pride is stained with contradiction. Because the very name that celebrates them also hides the truth of their removal. So what does Indiana really mean? Is it a tribute? Or is it a monument to a loss that can never be reclaimed? To answer that, we have to go back, before the highways, before the cities, before the farmland stretched endlessly across the horizon. Back to when this was truly the land of the Indians. The early story. Who were the Indians of Indiana? Long before Indiana was a state, long before it was even a concept, this land was home. The forests, rivers, and open plains weren't empty waiting for settlement. They were alive with nations whose presence stretched back centuries. The Miami people lived along the Wabash River, their villages built near fertile ground and waterways that carried trade. They weren't just hunters and gatherers, they were diplomats, traders, and stewards of a land they knew like no one else. The Miami language gave names to the rivers, to the valleys, and even to the places that still echo today. To the south and east lived the Shawnee, a people known for their resilience and movement, resisting pressure from colonization further east and seeking refuge in Indiana's fertile ground. They carried with them stories of migration, spiritual practices, and a fierce determination to protect their independence. The Potawatomi established their villages in the north, close to Lake Michigan and the dense forests that provided food, shelter, and medicine. They called themselves the people of the place of fire, guardians of a spiritual flame passed down through generations. The Delaware, known as the Lenape, were driven westward from their ancestral homes in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, eventually finding temporary refuge in Indiana's valleys and woodlands. Their very presence here was a reminder that Indiana was not a permanent homeland for all, but often a last stop for those displaced by waves of expansion. And then there were the Kickapoo, skilled horsemen and hunters, whose movements across Indiana's prairies showed a deep understanding of balance with the natural world. Together, these nations formed a tapestry of life across Indiana. Their villages dotted the rivers, their council fires burned under the open sky, and their footsteps pressed paths into the earth that would later become the roads and trails settlers would follow. But what bound all of these peoples together was more than land. It was the profound relationship they held with it. Every river bend, every stretch of forest, every prairie had meaning, spiritual, cultural, eternal. To them, Indiana wasn't just land to be owned. It was a living relative, something to be cared for, respected, and passed on to future generations. Yet, as settlers poured westward, they didn't see Indiana as a living homeland. They saw it as opportunity. Land to be divided, sold, and transformed into farmland. And soon, the presence of these nations, so deeply tied to Indiana's very soul, was seen not as a part of its identity, but as an obstacle to its future. And that's where the story of Indiana's name turns darker, into a tale of broken promises, forced treaties, and removals that would change this land forever. The broken promises, treaties, and removal. The story of Indiana's tribes is not just about who they were, but about what was taken from them. And it began with treaties, documents written in ink, but sealed in betrayal. In 1795, the Treaty of Greenville forced tribes like the Miami and Shawnee to cede large parts of southern and eastern Indiana after the Northwest Indian War. It was presented as peace, but it was really the beginning of a relentless march of land loss. Then came the Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818, a defining moment. Under immense pressure, the Miami, Delaware, and Potawatomi were forced to give up millions of acres, essentially opening the central part of Indiana to white settlement. The land that had carried their stories for centuries was signed away in exchange for promises of annuities, supplies, and protection that were rarely kept. Each treaty that followed carried the same cruel pattern. The government would approach tribes with the language of friendship, only to demand more land. Leaders were often coerced, bribed, or threatened into signing. Some treaties were signed by men who didn't even represent their people. Others were flat out ignored the moment they were inconvenient to the United States' growing hunger for expansion. The most tragic consequence came with forced removals. By the 1830s, under the shadow of the Indian Removal Act, the Potawatomi were violently driven westward. In 1838, over 850 Potawatomi men, women, and children were rounded up and marched at gunpoint from their Indiana homelands to what is now Kansas. More than 40 died along the way from exhaustion, disease, and starvation. This brutal journey is remembered as the Trail of Death. The Miami, once the largest tribe in Indiana, faced the same fate. Most were removed to Kansas in the 1840s, though a small band managed to remain, clinging to their homeland despite constant pressure. The Delaware, already refugees once, were again uprooted and pushed west. And through it all, the irony deepened. Even as the tribes were stripped of their homes, the name Indiana, the land of the Indians, remained on the maps. The identity of the state was now tied to people who were being erased from it. This was the great paradox. The state celebrated their name while silencing their presence. Indiana had been emptied of the very nations it was named after. And that's where the contradiction at the heart of Indiana's story comes into sharp focus, the paradox. A name without its people, it is one of the cruelest ironies in American history. A state called Indiana, land of the Indians, built upon the absence of the very people it names. By the mid-19th century, most of Indiana's native nations were gone. The Potawatomi marched west on the Trail of Death. The Miami scattered to Kansas and Oklahoma. The Delaware and Shawnee were forced to seek new homelands again and again. Only a few small groups managed to remain, often under constant threat of removal. Yet while the people were pushed out, their identity was frozen in place. The word Indiana lingered on every map, every legal document, every proud declaration of statehood. The name became a symbol of the land, but stripped of the humanity it was meant to describe. To settlers, the name carried a kind of romanticism. It evoked a wilderness conquered, a land once belonging to the Indians, but now claimed and transformed into farms, towns, and cities. The title honored their memory only as a past tense, as if native people were shadows fading into history rather than living nations enduring injustice. This paradox extended beyond the state's name. Counties, rivers, towns, and landmarks across Indiana carried native names: Wabash, Tippecanoe, Miami, Potawatomi Park. The land itself spoke in native languages, but the voices of the people were silenced. It was as though the state wanted the echo of their presence, without the responsibility of their survival. And this is where the paradox becomes more than irony. It becomes erasure. Indiana preserved the names but not the nations. It claimed the heritage but pushed away the heirs. It carried the title land of the Indians while ensuring that few Indians remained upon it. But history has a way of refusing silence. Even in the face of removal, erasure, and broken promises, traces of the original nations endured, sometimes hidden, sometimes whispered, sometimes defiantly alive. And those echoes still remain. Despite removal, despite treaties signed under duress, despite the relentless push to erase them from their homeland, the story of Indiana's native nations did not end. Their presence lingers, sometimes quietly, sometimes defiantly, in ways that remind us the land of the Indians is more than just a name. Some Miami families resisted removal, refusing to leave the land where their ancestors were buried. Through petitions, legal battles, and sheer resilience, a small community remained in northern Indiana. Today, the Miami Nation of Indiana, though still fighting for full federal recognition, continues to honor its heritage, language, and traditions right here in the state that once tried to force them out. The Potawatomi, though most were sent west, also left their mark. Annual memorials of the Trail of Death retrace the brutal journey of 1838, ensuring the tragedy is not forgotten. Descendants of those who walked it still return, keeping alive the memory of their ancestors' suffering and survival. Even beyond the people themselves, the land holds echoes. Look at Indiana's map and you'll see it: Tippecanoe, Wabash, Muncie, Mishawaka. Every place name is a living reminder that these lands once spoke in native tongues. The rivers and towns whisper their original names, even if many residents don't know their meanings. In schools, too, the story is being retold. Programs and cultural centers now teach about the Miami, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and others, giving younger generations a chance to hear voices that were nearly silenced. Ceremonies, powwows, and language revitalization efforts bring back traditions once thought lost. And perhaps the strongest echo is in memory itself. Every time Indiana's name is spoken, it is an unintentional acknowledgement, a reminder that this state is tied to a people whose story is older, deeper, and more enduring than its borders. The echoes remain, but what do they mean? Do they honor the people who once called this land home, or do they remind us of what was taken from them? That is the question at the heart of Indiana's name. And to answer it, we must ask ourselves, what does "Land of the Indians" really mean? When we hear the name Indiana, it's easy to treat it as just another label on a map. But when we pause, when we peel back the layers, the name demands something more of us. It forces us to confront the weight of history. On the surface, Land of the Indians could sound like a tribute, a recognition that this soil belonged first to the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, the Delaware, and the Kickapoo. But look closer, and it becomes a paradox wrapped in grief. How can a state honor native people in name, while erasing them in reality? The truth is, the name Indiana carries both memory and loss. It is a reminder that native nations once flourished here, their lives woven into every river and trail. But it is also a monument to dispossession, a record of how those same nations were stripped of the very land that still bears their name. Some might say the name is hollow, that it keeps alive only a shadow of the people it was meant to describe. But others argue it can serve as a reminder, a word that pushes us to remember, to learn, and to face the uncomfortable truth that America's progress often came at a devastating cost. Perhaps the meaning of Indiana is not fixed. Perhaps it is not only about what was lost, but about how we choose to remember. About whether we let the name remain a relic of erasure, or transform it into a living reminder of resilience and survival. Because the story of Indiana is not just history. It is a mirror held up to all of us, asking, when we speak the names of this land, do we hear the voices behind them? And that question leads us to the heart of this journey, what we must do with the knowledge we carry now. Indiana is more than fields of corn, small towns, and bustling cities. Beneath every road and river lies a story far older than statehood. A story of nations who loved this land, who named it, who fought for it, and who were forced to leave it. The name Indiana, Land of the Indians, is not just a title, it is a memory carved into the map. A reminder that progress was built on sacrifice, that survival came at a cost too great to measure. It asks us not to look away, but to remember. Because to say Indiana is to speak their presence, whether we realize it or not. It is to carry forward the story of the Miami who still fight for recognition, the Potawatomi who remember the trail of death, and every nation whose footsteps shaped this land. So the next time you hear the word Indiana, don't let it pass as just a name. Let it be a call to remember the people behind it. Learn their stories. Honor their survival. Acknowledge their loss. Because names are not just words, they are histories, and they are responsibilities. And maybe, just maybe, when we speak the name Indiana with truth, we can begin to give back some of the respect that was denied.